The 5.56 Nato. The 223 Remington. The Wunder cartridge that basically turns into a blender in the thoracic cavity, or a pea shooter, perhaps fit for rodents, but not much else. You get all kinds of varying views and opinions on the 5.56. But where is the truth? I will try and come at this fair and honestly, because God's word dictates that we should try and be fair and honest. For it is written, "You shall do no injustice in judgment in measurements of length, weight, or volume." It is also written, "You shall not have in your bag differing measures, a heavy and a light. You shall not have in your house differing measures, a large and a small. You shall have a perfect and a just weight and a perfect and a just measure." With that, we're all shaped by our training and experience and our knowledge at the time. We're going to try and look at the 5.56 fairly and circumspectly today on Gunfighter Life. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about guns and gunfighting the right way, with God Almighty at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. On that experience, not the pre-recorded bio. You heard the pre-recorded one a bunch, or one of those several versions of it, because I don't generally like talking about myself every episode. I think it's important to establish some bona fides with the things that God's allowed me to get through in life. This bio is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to try and focus on my experience with the 5.56/223. So I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I was there for the initial invasion of Iraq. My MOS is one that no longer exists, but an 03 derivative, which is infantry. Marine Corps infantry is kind of known as like the quintessential grunt. As you might imagine, I used this weapon. I was deployed to war multiple times. I was also an urban warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps. Taught many weapon systems chambered in the 5.56. I also served in the United States Army National Guard full-time and reserve status. Held the MOS of 11 Bravo, which is their basic infantryman. Also did some few other things, but as far as the 5.56 goes, so I have experience in both branches of the armed forces. I have experience with the M16, well, many platforms. Move on, I guess, and then we'll go back to some of the different platforms. Also served law enforcement. I was LAPD, law enforcement officer. I worked regular patrol assignments. And I worked some more specialized assignments. I worked assignments attached to the feds and worked with many other agencies. That's all I'll really say about that. I've also been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency that I won't specify. Private contractor, mercenary, whatever you want to call it. I have done that and also used this cartridge in law enforcement and in private contracting. Also been a competitive shooter, so you might imagine I'm familiar with it in that context. I've also been a professional big game hunter and guide. And I'm familiar with the 223 in a hunting context. So, different sporting rifles, bolt-action rifles. For the military service, the M16A2, the M16A4, the CAR-15, which is a full auto variant. I should specify the military M16A2 and A4s that I used were safe semi-3 round burst. Familiar with the SAW, squad automatic weapon. Also in law enforcement, in addition to different various ARs, I did use the Mini 14. It was one of the options available, as well as full auto variants of different 5.56 platforms. Private contracting, I can't say too much about what we used, but I don't think it's giving too much away to say that we used heavily 5.56 platforms. I was also the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters. I used different calibers for that too, but one of the calibers we used quite a bit was 5.56. So, doesn't seem like that long, but well over 20 years of real-world, first-hand experience in combat, law enforcement, private contracting, all that stuff, a lot of it dealing with the 5.56. So you might think I have a fond love and affection for this cartridge. I do not. I'm just being honest. I'm trying to be honest. I'm going to try and be unbiased, but we're all shaped by our training and experience. We'll try and tell you what the 5.56 does well and what it kind of leaves to be desired. I would love to get into the history of the 5.56 development / the 223. However, for everything that you think is true, there's some conflicting story about it. Here's what's fairly well established. We know what was basically going on in the world at the time. We know what came before it. We know that the M16 was a replacement for the M14, which is a full power, full size battlefield rifle. The intermediate cartridge was a thing long before this, but I think World War II really proved the effectiveness of intermediate cartridges. The 8 Kurtz, the hot-loaded 7.62 by 25, the Tokarov round, and the PPSH still dealt with some of those, Soviet submachine guns during the war in Iraq. But the intermediate cartridge was a proven concept then. And it only made sense that we would look at an intermediate cartridge. Intermediate cartridges, as a whole, as a group, have advantages. They have less recoil. And I don't care how big and burly and manly you are. It's just how physics works. No matter how good you control recoil, if you have less recoil, you can get hits on target faster. In most circumstances, if it's just somebody standing right in front of you at 2 yards, that's kind of a moot point because the muzzle's never going to move off the target. Talking about anything past, let's say 15 yards. I don't care how good you control recoil in a rifle. If you reduce it, you can get consecutive hits on target faster. That's an advantage for an intermediate cartridge versus a full-powered rifle cartridge. Another advantage, you can't get around it, is, again, physics, mathematics, weight, firepower versus mobility. As an infantryman, speaking as a former grunt, ammo is not the only thing that you carry. The rifle is not the only thing that you carry. You carry so much other stuff. You're kind of like a tactical Ninja Turtle. There's just so much stuff. Not just the tactical stuff too, not just like the fragmentation grenades, the M67s, not just the rocket launcher you might have, not just the Satchel Charger C4 that you might carry, not just your night vision, not just your PECs that are mounted to your rifle, not just all that other stuff. What about chow? What about water, right? Because when you're in Iraq in the summer, water's a big deal. Water's heavy. What about comms? You ever have to carry a Prick 19? They're heavy. What about all the other things that go into being an infantryman, being a grunt, right? So the ammo in the gun is not the only part of that. If you have, let's say, 100 pounds allotted for weapon system, right, you can carry more ammo if the ammo round per round weighs less. That's a real advantage to the intermediate cartridge. Now, the big rival to this cartridge, starting at the very tail end of World War II and into the very early part of the Cold War, the 7.62x39. Now, I'm not going to do too much comparing the two, but let's just say we went, for whatever reason, in a very different direction. The 30 cal was pretty proven, or the, somewhere between 7 and 8 millimeter was really proven all throughout the world, all throughout both world wars. A lot of the major powers use somewhere between 7 and 8 millimeter. Some use a 6.5, which is still a very good bore diameter. But the U.S. went in a pretty unique direction in going with a super high velocity 22 caliber, .224 diameter, despite the name 223. Now, talking about in the beginning God's law, it is also written you shall not circulate a false report. It is hard even for me doing research to find sources that agree by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses a matter is established. It is hard to find sources that agree with the actual history of the 223/556. But it does seem pretty well established that sometime in the 50s, we were well on our way to developing this cartridge. Be a little bit different than we see it today. Initially, and what we first fielded was a 55 grain, commonly now referred to as the XM193. It would have some teething issues. When the mass NATO adopted it sometime later, what we now call the 5.56, we would decide to go, I believe, with a Belgian design, 62 grain, what you might know as the 62 grain or the green tip or the LAP round or the M855 was kind of standardized on, and I don't know if that was the very first iteration of the 5.56 NATO mass adoption by NATO. Again, I don't want to put out a bunch of conjecture here. And I've said stuff in the past, and my patrons were like, well, that's not true. I heard this. I wasn't there. I don't know. I just want to stick to what we know. You have to remember, too, this is way, way pre-internet. I shouldn't have to say that, right? But way pre-internet, and we were in the Cold War. Information was not as flowing as it is today. We're like, it's pretty known what's going on with the M7 right now, or the M5 or the M7, supposed to be the military's new service rifle. We kind of know its development. We know about the cartridge. It's so easy to look that stuff up, but in the 50s, it was not so. We're also in the Cold War with Russia. So it's not like we wanted all this information out there on the table. A lot of what we think we know, we may not actually know. It just may be anecdotal. But it does seem fairly clear from what I understand, unlike the Soviets, wherein they had the 7.62x39 cartridge and they liked it, they designed the SKS, and then they wanted that cartridge, and they designed the AK-47 to fire that cartridge. The AR-15, the predecessor, was the AR-10, developed by Eugene Stoner, originally in 308, or 7.62x51 NATO, which was the cartridge de jour, the cartridge of the day. That rifle was designed actually around a full-powered rifle cartridge, and they went to an intermediate cartridge. A little bit different in development there. And I don't want to speculate as to their reasons as to why they went with the 223/556. But here are some real attributes of the 5.56. It is flat shooting. It gives you a longer point blank range. Point blank does not mean like a foot away. That's what a lot of people think that it means. Point blank means that I can aim center of mass on a target and hit somewhere on the acceptable zone of that target without having to shift my point of aim or adjust the dope on my rifle. High velocity rounds give you a really good point blank range. They're not as good at distance. They shed velocity fairly fast after a certain distance. But for max point blank range, that's a real advantage, and I think a real advantage of the 5.56. I said that I would try and be fair in my dealings with this cartridge. It does give you a pretty good point blank range. It also gives you less recoil, which especially comes in full auto. If you've ever fired a 7.62 NATO full auto and fired a 5.56 full auto, right? You'll even in comparable platforms, you'll know there's a difference there. And remember, the M16A1 was originally full auto. The 3-round burst came in later. It has less recoil. It's also lighter. It is lighter round for round by far than the 308 or the 7.62x51, our prior cartridge. It's lighter even than the Soviet 7.62x39 by quite a bit. You look at the M16, you look at the magazines, you look at the cartridge itself. Everything in that system is lighter. That is an advantage. Firepower versus mobility. You can move easier. You can move around easier. You can also carry more ammo. Now, I don't know whether the 5.56 223 was designed as a wounding cartridge or a killing cartridge, here's what I will say. If it was designed as a great killing cartridge, it seems to have not done that as well as most other previous cartridges. If you look at its effectiveness, round for round, it's far less than the 7.62 x 51, but then the 308. Far less than the round that preceded it, the 30-06. So if that was the goal, I don't get it. If the goal was to make up for round per round effectiveness by having more, so you just throw more rounds downrange, that's just a different philosophy. I have heard different places about they wanted the ability to penetrate, I guess, a Soviet helmet at a certain amount of distance, but I think that's more of a minimum standard. They wanted it to be at least that powerful. For that, they would shoot pine boards. I don't think that they were looking at killing pine boards. I think that was just one of the parameters. We need it to be at least this powerful. There's a lot of conjecture and a lot of kind of spitballing as to why they developed the cartridge the way that they did. But either way, they did develop it. It was adopted. Both the M16 AR-15 pattern and the 223/5.56 forever intertwined. You can get, obviously, 5.56 rifles that are not AR patterns, and you can get AR patterns that are not 5.56, but they, so like you can eat peanut butter and banana sandwiches, they go together kind of like peanut butter and jelly. Most of the time, where you find one, you'll find the other. Now, the whole reason I did this episode was I was going to do an episode. The original thought today was going beyond the XM193, which is a 55 grain, and the M855, which is a 62 grain, commonly referred to as green tip. Going beyond that, going a different direction, that other loads, maybe to optimize this platform for different uses. Now, if you're interested in that, make sure you're subscribed, liked, following the podcast, whatever vernacular your host uses. Make sure you're following, subscribe to the podcast. Because God willing, that episode is one that I would like to do in the future. So again, make sure you're subscribed, following. But I don't think I've done an entire episode on the 5.56/223. So probably shouldn't put the cart before the horse. Here we are. Again, you might think that from my experience, I'm just the biggest fanboy of this cartridge. And I know a lot of servicemen are. And no disrespect. They have their own opinions. But here's what I will say. A lot of people that serve in the military today, they may have never seriously been around weapons, shot weapons, competed, hunted before their military service. So if you're never really been exposed to anything else, it's not really your fault. And if you go to boot camp and they say, this is the best rifle on the planet and this cartridge is awesome and it turns internal organs into jello and whatever, you don't have anything to compare that to. I am very blessed by God that I've been shooting from a very early age. I'm very humbled that God's allowed me to do as much in life as He has, and I'm humbled by the talents that He gives me. That said, I was a gold medalist rifle shooter before I ever joined the Marine Corps at 17. I had also grown up hunting and literally putting meat on the table for the family. Had a lot of experience with guns before the Marine Corps. I remember the first time I shot an M16, and I was expecting it to be, I guess, powerful. It's a military gun after all. Just the pop of that round and the lack of recoil, and I remember that kind of springy feeling in my shoulder of that giant spring moving back and forth, and it kind of left me a little baffled. And I still had fun with it. I thought it was a fun experience shooting that for the first time, but did not leave me super impressed with the power of that cartridge. And in fact, when you compare it to most just deer hunting rounds, it is far less powerful than what people would consider like a first or youth rifle in a 243. You look at just as a matter of fact, the 5.56 is very, very underpowered compared to what most would consider a beginner deer cartridge, the 223. It's much less powerful than that. It's much less powerful than the 308, than the 30-06, than the 270, than the 300 Win Mag, etc. Up until very recently, and with a big jump up in bullet construction technology, most people considered it not suitable even for deer. And I think our military also saw a lack in this cartridge, as we have moved away from it. Again, if it goes forward, adopting the M5/M7/277 Fury. Now, whatever they might have designed the round for, I wasn't there, but if you're facing a uniformed combatant army where they're there, they get wounded, they get medics, they get taken out of the fight. Depending on their wounds, they may get patched up and put back in the fight, or they may just be done. The fact that they die or not is inconsequential to you as an army. You fast forward a little bit, we're not fighting the Russians in the Cold War like we thought we might with a giant land army invasion. You fast forward to the global war on terror, we're fighting radical Islamic terrorists that want to take Christians and cut their head off with a dull knife. And they will do it by any means necessary, and they literally want to die trying. Like, they think they're going to get some virgins and some garbage BS religion philosophy. That's the enemy that we ended up fighting. It doesn't matter if you wound them, you got to stop them. A lot of them, because they don't care. They want to die in the fight. That's a different adversary. And I think that round left a little bit to be desired, to put it politely. And we see the military moving away from that in going back to a more powerful rifle cartridge in the 277 Fury. Again, if that goes forward. It's not what I would have picked. I would have had probably a different choices in that. But the fact that they did move to a more powerful cartridge shows kind of a limitation in the 5.56. The 5.56 has its advantages and disadvantages, to be fair. It has the advantages of being a very high velocity, lightweight, small caliber round. It's a 22 caliber high velocity round. Let's look at some numbers. Let's look at the 55 grain. Now, some of these numbers I'm going to get from Wikipedia here, but what I would call one of the early loads, the 55 grain out of a 20-inch barrel. Because remember, the original M16 and even the M16A2, they were a 20-inch barrel. The XM193 is a 55 grain, and it's going at 3260 feet per second per Wikipedia, but 55 grain at 32. Again, that's a light bullet at very high velocity, which has its advantages, which has its different effects on target. Now, a lot of people will point to this and say this round is so good because it tumbles. And I guess my response to that would be, yeah, if it tumbles, it can be good. It can punch above its weight class. However, I would not say that tumbling is consistent. Going mostly to my professional big game hunting and guiding career and just a lifetime of hunting, bullets can do strange things. Even really good premium hunting bullets can do weird things. May this bullet tumble? It might not. A lot of that depends on so many external factors. How big is your adversary? At what distance are they being hit? At what velocity is it going? Because you're talking 3,200 at the muzzle, not 3,200 at 500 meters. Also, so many factors like, did it hit a rib? If so, at what angle? There's so many factors. So can it tumble and do a fair amount of damage? Yes, it can. It can also not tumble. And I think that may be where some of this inconsistency, and some people saying it's so great, and some people saying it's a pea shooter or something, some version thereof. I think that's where a lot of that comes in. A later adoption, again, when Nato adopted it, it would go to the 62 grain. You'll see the SS-109, and you'll see probably what we're more familiar with, the M855 for the M855A1. But you're bumping up to a 62 grain. There's some different bullet construction. You may see a tungsten tip in there to help with penetration. You're dropping down a little bit in velocity there. 62 grain M855A1 to 3150. So we see early on at the beginning, they wanted a little bit heavier bullet. Whoever was in charge of these NATO trials decided not to adopt the lighter, faster 55 grain. And we see much more recent development in the Mark II 62, which is a 77 grain, strangely kind of a match bullet. But this obviously was to address some at least perceived shortcomings in the 55 grain or 62 grain loadings. So we see even within the 5.56 trying to get back to heavier bullets, right? These bullets get heavier, they don't get lighter. Okay, so what's the rub here? What's the deal for you? Well, if you're in the military, you're a grunt, you're a frontline infantryman, you're going to get issued what you're going to get issued, and you're going to like it, or you're not going to like it, but you're still going to have to deal with it. For instance, during the war, during the initial invasion, I had a catastrophic failure in my much old and beat up, at the time, M16A2. Literally catastrophic, meaning it was not like a tap rack bang, double feed, even a triple feed, bolt override. It was none of those. The gun was broke. In the middle of the invasion, God's gotten me through a lot of sticky situations. Just put it that way. The point is, you get what you get, and you make do with that equipment. So if you're in the military, you're not going to get to pick like, oh, I don't really like the 5.56. Well, they're a private smith. Nobody cares. At least nobody cares enough to give you a different rifle. If you get issued, you join in the future, or you get transitioned to the 277 Fury, that's cool. Maybe you're the guy that's a big fan of the 5.56. It's not going to matter. If you want the 5.56, you're still going to issue the 277 Fury. So in the military, you get issued what you're issued. You get issued what ammo you're issued. Unless you're like super high speed special forces dude, then you may get an option of different weapon platforms. But for the average person in the military, you don't get to pick. That's not how it works. But I would assume that most of you, I know that we do, by God's grace, have a lot of patrons who are veterans. I would assume there's a lot higher margin of veterans in this audience than in general public, which I'm very humbled by that you guys would come here to listen. But a lot of you, veterans or not, right now can choose your weapons platform. Thankfully, a lot of law enforcement gives you some liberty. I mentioned I worked some more specialized assignments. Sometimes I had access to the full armory. Could have literally taken out a Thompson submachine gun. We still had them in the inventory from like back in the Prohibition days. I'm not even joking. I wouldn't do that because I want to keep breathing. They were fun to take out to the range literally for fun, but they're tanks. But I had some liberty. I could take out a full auto Car 15. I could take out a Mini 14. I could take out a 12 gauge with buckshot and slugs, depending on the mission, depending on what I wanted to do, because it was a more specialized assignment. I had that liberty. So some law enforcement, some agencies are going to be like, this is the approved rifle, like it or don't. Some agencies will give you some liberty in what you want to choose. Again, if you're trying to choose different options within the munition of the 5.56 or 223, hopefully that'll be an episode in the future. So make sure you're following, subscribed. And a lot of us are civilians. And even if you're law enforcement or military, you're at least some of the time living in the civilian world, unless you're deployed. But when you're back CONUS, continental United States, try not to use too many acronyms. I know a lot of shows really like that and it makes it seem tactical, but I try and make a show that most people can understand. When you're CONUS, continental United States, back home, you're not on base, right, and you're just kicking around, you're a civilian. You still may have to deal with an active shooter. Just because you're not in uniform doesn't mean you shouldn't still be a man. Provide and protect for those around you. So even military law enforcement, there's times where you're going to have your own weapon, hopefully. So for when you do get to choose, what's the rub? What's the real deal on this 5.56? And I guess it took a long time to get here, but I think it was hopefully useful information. Well, here are two big advantages. Number one, here in America, I know we have listeners from all around the world, but here in America, it's one of the most available, readily available center fire rounds, especially in the intermediate rounds. Also, I checked on AmmoSeek, and it seems to be the most affordable center fire common rifle round. I thought maybe the 7.62x39 would still be cheaper. There were days when it was, when you could get a glut of cheap military surplus 7.62x39. Those days seem to be behind us. It looks like you can get 223 cheaper than you can get 7.62x39. What does that mean? It should mean that you can train more readily available and cheaper. So if you have, unless you have an unlimited blue sky ammo budget, like some three-letter government agency is going to issue you 277 Fury, let's say your ammo budget is $100 a month. You're going to be able to buy a lot more 223 for $100 a month than 277 Fury for $100 a month, or even 308. And the most important thing, no matter how good or anemic a rifle round is, or any round is, most important is shot placement. A miss with a 308 is not as effective as a hit with a 5.56. You train more. Hopefully, if you train right, now practice doesn't make perfect. You can go out to the range and blow 500 rounds in a day and be a worse shooter than when you got there. I've known guys that just like to shoot a bunch of rounds and turn money into noise, and that's great if that's what you want to do, but don't confuse that for effective training. But assuming you are training equally effectively, you should be able to get more effective with the same budget with that round because it's cheaper. You can put more rounds down range. You can mitigate a lot of that with dry fire and stuff like that, but you still need to put rounds down range, and you can buy more of the rounds with the 223. Also, if you want to stockpile ammo, because if you're, older than 5, you've lived through an ammo shortage. If you're an adult, you've likely lived through a couple of ammo shortages at this point. So putting it away, not so that you can hoard it like squirrel it away, but so that even when there's an ammo shortage, you can still train with it. I think this is where a lot of survivalists and preppers go wrong. I consider myself a survivalist and a prepper, but I would like to keep on practicing until I get down to being able to fill the magazines that I have. Because it doesn't matter if you have 10,000 rounds stored up. If you die in your next firefight, if you die in your next gunfight, what good are those 10,000 rounds? They're not doing you any good. Better that you train even in an ammo shortage and be good and have a couple of magazines and be good with them than have 10,000 rounds and you have little to no training with. Those rounds are not going to save you. I think a lot of people get this wrong that are gun people. A gun is not a security blanket. The mere fact that you have it doesn't mean anything. It's a pile of plastic and or wood and steel. It is inanimate until you put the animation into it. You have to be effective with that tool to do that job, to stop that bad person from doing that bad thing. Anyway, getting back on target with this podcast and this episode, you're going to be able to get rounds on target, I think, with a given budget, probably easier with 5.56 than most other rounds. That's a big advantage if you're talking about center fire, offensive/defensive kind of rounds. The 22 long rifle obviously is its own thing, and I would encourage you to train and practice with and stockpile 22 long rifle for the same reasons. Ability to train, ability to get ammo, to shoot ammo affordably, but it's not in the same class as 5.56, 223. Some other advantages we aforementioned, right? It's a high velocity 22 round, so you get less recoil. There is a reason that the AR-15 and the 223 really rule in things like 3-gun, unless you have another class like heavy metal. That's a different class for a reason. Because the 223 5.56 is faster, especially on long stages, and it has that long point blank range where you can shoot an array of targets at literally 3 yards. You can drop down and hit a target at 300 yards and aim center mass and hit that like steel IPSC target and expect to hit it without having to do any dope adjustments, without having to do any Kentucky windage or holdover unless it's a crazy windy day. But you get the idea. The fact that you can engage a target at bad breath distance out to, let's say, 300, 320 meters by just aiming center mass. That's a big deal. Also, I will concede that it's often in a two-way exchange of gunfire, the first person to get a hit on target can oftentimes get more hits on target. So if you get a round in somebody, you can often get more rounds into that person. So the first person to get a hit, that's good. That's good in a gunfight, whether you're talking about CCW handgun or you're talking about on a battlefield or a defensive encounter. If you miss with your first or second round, the ability, again, to recover from recoil quickly, and I don't care how good you recover from it, if there's less of it, you can recover quicker. So that is an advantage. The fact that you don't have to think about holdover, and you might just say, well, you just should know your holdovers at different distances. But, if you're running from, I was an urban warfare instructor, you're running through a city street from one side to the other, from cover to cover, and a target presents itself firing at you, and somebody that you care about, that you serve with, has just been shot, and they're screaming, and you're returning fire in that split second. You really expect to be able to look at that target, identify it, be able to judge whether it's at 220 yards or 280 yards, and adjust for dope while you're running across the street. I mean, just throwing one scenario out there. The ability to have that long point blank range, multiple rounds with less recoil is a big deal. That's a real thing. I'm not going to take away from that. And you might be listening to this part and thinking, oh, it's a great round. It should be the best. Well, what are the cons? Again, it's not great, I don't think, ballistically. It's less effective round per round than many other rounds, I think, including even the 7.62 x 39. So I wouldn't say that it's great round for round. And again, if you're facing that determined attacker, whether they be on PCP or meth or fentanyl, or they're just a religious extremist that just wants to kill as many people as possible, and they're not going to stop if wounded, if that's your adversary, you might not want just a round that may work. Like it may tumble, right? Maybe that's not what you want. It also isn't great, despite the fact that green tip is called LAP, a penetrator round. It's not great at intermediate barriers compared to other rounds. It's just not. Compared to like 308. So if you're trying to do something like stop a vehicle, for instance, when I was the commander of a tactical team, sometimes I would carry an AR derivative. Sometimes I would carry a SCAR 17 308, especially if our main threat was likely to be, if we had intel, a vehicle ramming. If I'm trying to stop a vehicle, I want the 308. I don't want 5.56. And yeah, 5.56 is lightweight, but you may need more of it. So that's kind of a toss-up, right? Especially if you've gotten to the point where you consider yourself a decent shooter. Yeah, I might be able to carry twice as much, but if it takes 2 or 3 rounds to neutralize something, you're talking about a car, if it takes a half a magazine where I could use 2 or 3 rounds of 308, does that really... Yeah, I have more rounds, but each round is less effective. So you would have to judge that for yourself and your parameters. Also, it's not great at distance, and not because it doesn't have a high ballistic coefficient or any of that. It's not super powerful to start with, and just like anything else, when it starts hitting that wind resistance, it's going to start to shed velocity. So if it's not crazy effective at 50 yards, it's going to be less effective at 250 yards or whatever. That's just how math works. Unless, again, you could get some weird anomaly where it just hits just right and tumbles just right, but I think you see that disparity more at distance, which I think is a big reason the military started looking at 277 Fury. I think more to do with its engagements in Afghanistan, because a lot of those were longer engagements, and the 5.56 just leaves a lot to be desired at longer ranges. And yeah, I was Marine Corps infantry back in the iron sight days, and I qualified expert. I can get hits with iron sights on a man-sized target at 500 yards. Yeah, I can punch a hole in that target. How effective is that 5.56 at 500 yards? after it shed so much velocity. Yeah, it got a hole in the target. Again, if that's a radical Muslim trying to kill as many Americans as possible and he's behind a machine gun, is that super relevant that I put a hole in him and he's going to die 5 minutes later? And he's, still sending rounds our way? I might want something a little bit ballistically more effective, and you might as well. You might decide for your ammo budget, for your needs, a 308 or some other cartridge, right, makes more sense for you. I just want to be fair and kind of give an honest look. I'm not saying it's a bad round. I'm not saying you shouldn't get it. There's a lot of really good advantages to the 5.56. But don't look at it with rose-tinted glasses. Look at it circumspectly. There are some real drawbacks to the 5.56/223. On that, I should mention, even a lot of debate on the differences, but let's just say, to be safe, if your gun is stamped 5.56, you can shoot. If it's stamped 5.56 or 223 Wild, which is just a different chamber cut, you can fire any of those. If you have a 223 stamped gun, like a bolt action hunting rifle, older something stamped 223, it's not advised that you fire 5.56 in it. Without getting super technical on like free bore and chamber cuts and all that, just for the practical application. So that's a fairly lengthy episode on just the 5.56/223. I've done an episode comparing the 5.56 to the 7.62x39. You can probably go back and search for that. And again, I hope to do one. So subscribe, follow if you want that one on kind of optimizing, going beyond the XM193-855. Hopefully you enjoyed this podcast. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If you did, you want to support, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get cool insider content. A lot of them choose to interact with me on a daily basis and ask me real questions in their real life. Like, I'm considering this gun versus this gun, or what do you think about this load versus this load, or what do you think about the 6.5 Creedmoor on this kind of game? I got a question like that this morning. Get questions all the time. I'm happy and humbled to help people out. That's why I do the podcast, to serve you guys. I'm humbled to be able to serve. Anyway, if you want to be part of that, become a patron, mostly to support the show, but also to contact me, maybe be a part of the insider chat if you want to be. Consider becoming a patron. You can sign up for $1. $1. And if you don't like it, you can go away and you've paid $1. Anyway, there should be a Patreon link in the show notes. With that, that's going to bring us to the tactical tip of the day. Your tactical tip of the day. You ever wonder why Magpul is called Magpul? Well, I believe it's because the first thing that they invented was a Magpul. Just a apparatus that goes on the bottom of an AR-15 magazine to help you grab it. Either pull it out of the rifle or pull it out of your magazine pouch. A Magpul. Well, before I ever remember hearing the term Magpul, like during the initial invasion and stuff like that, what one might do and what one could still do was take some super high speed 550 cord, state of the art, and some awesome revolutionary duct tape. If you got one of the older metal mags, take the base plate off, gut the 550 cord, which just means take the white strands out of it so it's thinner, tie a knot on each side, or put it on the outside, and put some duct tape on it. And you've created your very own Magpul. Nothing wrong with buying the factory Magpuls if you want, but if you have like a certain setup on your chest rig, on your war belt, and that magazine is just a little bit hard to grab, you might want to make one of those. That's your tactical tip of the day. That said, I really prefer actually the Magpul magazines, the polymer magazines, Magpul, Amen 2, and the Lancers. Not necessarily in that order. And with that, that's going to bring us to the tactical verse or verses of the day. And I think I'm going to repeat the ones from the beginning of the episode. You shall do no injustice in judgment in measurements of length, weight, or volume. Also, You shall not have in your bag differing weights, a heavy and a light. You shall not have in your house differing measures, a large and a small. You shall have a perfect and a just weight and a perfect and a just measure. Also, another one, it is written, you shall not circulate a false report. I try to be fair and honest in this episode today, but more important than the 556, men, be fair and honest with your dealings with each other or with anything in life. Just because you don't like something, don't just assume what you hear about it that's bad is true. Or if you really like something and really want something to be true, don't just assume that it is true. By the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is established. Like independent, verifiable stuff. Not you heard it somewhere. That's not a witness. I heard is not a witness. I heard is conjecture. Likewise, you could have hundreds of people that say something that aren't a witness. Be fair and honest in your dealings. God calls us to be fair and honest. We're also called to be holy, for it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. You want to be holy means set apart if you don't know. I think a lot of modern people, even Christians, have a skewed view of what holy means. It means set apart and different. We're called to be set apart and different. You want to be set apart and different in this culture? One way, just one way, there are many ways, but one way you can do that is stop regurgitating just stuff you heard, whether it was called news or not, if you don't know that it's true. I heard that so-and-so did this or so-and-so did that. Why are you spreading that? You shall not circulate a false report. Just because you don't like the person or the politician or whatever, that doesn't give you license to spread rumors. You shall not circulate a false report. Do not go about as a talebearer among your people. That's also in God's word. Don't go about as a talebearer. If you don't know it to be true, why are you spreading it? You want to be holy, set apart in today's culture and society? Try doing that. Anyway, with that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.